Okay, guys, so this is the first recording of the peripheral nervous system. Um, Now, the peripheral nervous system, we are now leaving the central nervous system of the brain and spinal cord. And this is the actual link of the central nervous system to the body and its external environments. The peripheral nervous system will detect sensory stimuli and deliver information to the central nervous system as sensory input. Remember that these are going to be afferent fibers, AFF. The central nervous system processes input and then transmits impulses through the peripheral nervous system to the muscle cells and glands as motor output, and these are efferent fibers, or EFF. The central nervous system, is going to send motor output either to effector organs, which would be muscles or glands. The peripheral nervous system is functionally divided into two divisions. We have our sensory division, which consists of the sensory or afferent neurons that detect and transmit sensory stimuli to the central nervous system. It has two anatomical subdivisions. The somatic sensory division, which detects both internal and external stimuli. This is general sense receptors will detect stimuli, for example, from the skin. Special sensory receptors will detect stimuli from your special sense organs: sight, hearing, balance, taste, smell. The visceral sensory division, this relays internal information like blood pressure from organs of the abdominal, pelvic, and thoracic cavities. The motor division, this actually consists of motor or efferent neurons that carry out motor functions of the nervous system. Subdivisions are based on organs that neurons contact, such as the somatic motor division. This is responsible for voluntary motor functions, composed of lower motor neurons, which directly trigger skeletal muscle contractions. The visceral motor division, which is responsible for maintaining many aspects of homeostasis by controlling involuntary motor functions in the body, neurons to innervate cardiac muscle cells, smooth muscle cells, and secretory cells of various glands. The motor division will consist of motor or efferent neurons carrying out motor functions of the nervous system, and there are several subdivisions to this as well. The autonomic nervous system is further divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. The sympathetic nervous system is going to be involved in homeostasis activities surrounding physical work and visceral responses of emotions. This is what we more commonly refer to as your fight or flight division. The parasympathetic system, which is rest and digest division, will involve digestion and maintaining body's homeostasis at rest. We will actually have a whole additional chapter just on the autonomic nervous system. That's our final chapter for A&P 1. So here you have a breakdown of the peripheral nervous system, the two main divisions. We have our sensory division and our motor division. The sensory division, again, is broken up into the somatic sensory division and the visceral sensory division. But then again, somatic means you have conscious awareness of these sensations. Visceral, you're not necessarily going to have conscious sensation of these stimuli. On the peripheral motor side, you have the somatic. This is conscious control of skeletal muscles. And then you have the visceral, which is your smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. So the peripheral nerves, these are the main organs of the peripheral nervous system. They consist of axons of many neurons bound together by connective tissue. Nerves of the peripheral nervous system contact or innervate a majority of structures in the body. And peripheral nerves could either be mixed nerves, which means they contain both sensory and motor neurons. They can also be sensory only, where they only contain sensory neurons. And motor nerves, which contain mostly motor neurons. We have what are referred to as the spinal nerves. These originate from the spinal cord and innervate structures below the head and neck. Anatomical structures associated with this group of nerves include the two collections of the axons that connect the peripheral nervous system with the spinal cord's gray matter. The anterior root consists of motor neurons. The posterior root is going to feature a swollen area that's going to house cell bodies of sensory neurons called the posterior root ganglion or the dorsal root ganglion. And you can see that right here. So on the posterior side of the posterior root, we can see the posterior root ganglion right here. And the posterior and anterior roots will fuse to form spinal nerve, just lateral to the posterior root ganglion. All 31 pairs of spinal nerves are mixed nerves. And so you can see that here. We have our posterior side. Again, this is going to be the sensory side, okay? And then you have your anterior side, which is going to be the motor side. So information is going to be coming up this way, going into the posterior root up to the central nervous system. Information coming from the central nervous system down to the anterior roots, and that would be motor in function. Now, looking at the overall arrangement of the nerves, we have the epineurium. This is the outermost layer of connective tissue that holds the motor and sensory axons together. These will be bundled into fascicles, small groups of bundled axons surrounded by connective tissue called the perineurium. Each individual axon within the fascicle is surrounded by its own connective tissue called the endoneurium. And we can see that here. Here we have the epineurium. This is going to be bundled into fascicles. And if we look at each of the fascicles, we can see that each one of those is surrounded by the endoneurium. And then within each fascicle, you have individually myelinated axons. Okay. Bundled along with the fascicles, you're actually going to have blood vessels that will also be feeding these neurons. If you remember, this looks very similar to what we saw with the muscles. The cranial nerves, on the other hand, these attach to the brain and mostly innervate structures in the head and neck. These are not formed by the fusion of sensory and motor roots like the spinal nerves. This allows for either purely sensory, mixed, or mostly motor nerves. The functions of the peripheral nervous system are integrated with those of the central nervous system. Sensory neurons detect stimuli at sensory receptors, after which the following events occurs. Detected stimuli are transmitted along sensory neuron, spinal or cranial, to the cerebral cortex. In the cortex, sensory information is interpreted, integrated, and an appropriate motor response is selected and initiated. The motor response is initiated by commands from motor areas of the cerebral cortex. This leads to the following events. Impulses travel to the spinal cord where neurons synapse with lower motor neurons of the peripheral nervous system. The lower motor neurons carry impulses to appropriate muscles via the cranial or spinal nerves where they trigger their contractions. Okay, so the next part is going to be the actual cranial nerves. 3 cranial nerves contain axons of only sensory neurons: olfactory, optic, and vestibular cochlear. This is 1, 2, and 8. 5 cranial nerves contain primarily axons of motor neurons, with their associated sensory axons responsible for proprioception. Proprioception is a stretch of the muscle, sending information back to the brain about whether the muscle is actually contracted or not. This will include the oculomotor, which is 3, the trochlear, which is 4, the abducens, which is 6, the accessory, which is 11, and the hypoglossal, which is 12. 4 cranial nerves are strictly what we would call mixed, where they contain both sensory and motor neurons. This will include the trigeminal, facial, glossopharyngeal, and the vagus nerve. So the first one is the olfactory nerves will arise from the olfactory receptor cells of the nasal cavity. This will pass through the cribriform plates of the ethmoid bone. Fibers will synapse in the olfactory bulbs. The pathways will terminate on the primary olfactory cortex. This is purely sensory in function. Here you can see the receptors here within the nasal cavity here. Here's the olfactory tract. You can see the nerve traveling back here, and it will travel up. The optic nerve, number 2, this arises from the retinas of the eye. This will pass through the optic canals, which will converge and partially cross over at the optic chiasm. The crossing over will actually flip and rotate the image as that it's sending to the brain. The optic tracts continue to the thalamus, where they will synapse. And then what happens is that will be sent to the occipital visual cortex, where the information will be sent. This is also a purely sensory nerve involved in vision. And you can see here, retinas of the eye are all around here. The nerves come, this is the optic chiasm, and then they go to the occipital lobe. The oculomotor nerve, fibers extend from the ventral midbrain through the superior orbital fissures to the extrinsic eye muscles. This will function in raising the eyelid, directing the eyeball, constricting the iris, and controlling the lens shape. And here you can see it's attached right here, and you can see it's going to travel, and it will attach right there at the midbrain. Okay. Number 4, the trochlear nerve. Fibers from the dorsal midbrain will enter the orbits via the superior orbital fissure. And this is actually going to innervate the superior oblique muscle, and you'll see those fibers attached directly to the superior oblique muscle. This is primarily a motor nerve that will direct the eyeball. And here is the superior oblique muscle right here. You can see the fibers, and again, primarily a motor muscle. The trigeminal nerve, this is cranial nerve number 5. This is the largest cranial nerve. There are 3 divisions. You have the ophthalmic, maxillary, and mandibular, or respectively V1, V2, V3. They will convey sensory impulses from various areas of the face, as such, from V1 and V2. And they will also supply motor fibers, V3, for mastication, which is the process of chewing. Okay, and here you can see, here's the ganglion of the trigeminal nerve. And you can see the sensory fibers pretty much on the whole front of the face here, sensory fibers down here, and then we have motor fibers down here, which is going to be involved in innervating the muscles involved in mastication. You can see that here. Number 6, the abducens nerve. The fibers from the inferior pons enter the orbits via the superior orbital fissure. This is also a motor neuron that innervates the lateral rectus muscle. And again, here's, you can see the innervation right there on the lateral rectus muscle, and again, primarily a motor neuron. Number 7, the facial nerves. The fibers from the pons travel through the internal acoustic meatus and emerge through the stylomastoid foramen to the lateral aspects of the face, the chief motor nerves of the face with 5 major branches. Motor functions include facial expression, parasympathetic impulses to the lacrimal and salivary glands. Sensory function, such as taste, from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. And here you can see the various, you have the temporal branch, zygomatic branch, the buccal branch, the mandibular branch right down here, and then the cervical branch down here. Number 8 is the vestibular cochlear nerve. These are afferent fibers for hearing receptors, the cochlear division, and equilibrium receptors, the vestibular division, will pass from the inner ear through the internal acoustic meatus and enter the brainstem at the pons medulla border. This is mostly sensory in function, small motor component for adjustment of sensitivity of the receptors. And again, two different divisions here. These are actually the semicircular canals. These are three canals that are in all three planes of space. And as fluid moves within these canals, they activate hairs, which is the sensory receptors, to sort of give the body's position in space. This is the vestibular nerve right here. This is the calcular. This is where you have sound waves, which will be picked up by the receptors there. And this is the cochlear nerve, and these two will fuse to form the vestibulocochlear nerve, which again is cranial nerve number 8. Number 9, the glossopharyngeal nerve. Fibers from the medulla leave the skull via the jugular foramen and run to the throat. Motor functions will include innervating part of the tongue and the pharynx for swallowing, and provide parasympathetic fibers to the parotid salivary glands. Sensory functions include fibers that conduct taste and general sensory impulses from the pharynx and posterior tongue, and impulses from the carotid chemoreceptors and baroreceptors. And again, here you can see innervation here, but also innervations here and here, the parotid gland. Number 10 is the vagus nerve. This is the only cranial nerve that extend beyond the head and neck regions. Fibers from the medulla exit the skull via the jugular foramen. Most motor fibers are parasympathetic fibers that help regulate the activities of the heart, lungs, and abdominal viscera. The sensory fibers carry impulses from the thoracic and abdominal viscera, baroreceptors, chemoreceptors, and taste buds of the posterior tongue and the pharynx. And again, here we can see the vagus nerve right here. And you can see that the vagus nerve is actually, we'll talk about this when we get to the autonomic nervous system, actually is going to have its hands on pretty much every single internal organ that is inside your body. And this is really how it has that overall autonomic control there. Number 11 is the accessory nerve. This is formed from the ventral rootlets from C1 through C5 region of the spinal cord, actually not the brain. The rootlets pass into the cranium via each foramen magnum. The accessory nerves exit the skull via the jugular foramen to innervate the trapezius and the sternocleidomastoid muscles. And here you can see the accessory nerves. And then finally, number 12, the hypoglossal nerves. The fibers from the medulla exit the skull via the hypoglossal canal. This innervate extrinsic and intrinsic muscles of the tongue that contribute to swallowing and speech. And again, here you can see innervation of most of the muscles involved with the tongue here. And again, this motor function will help with that of speech. So here's a nice little figure that sort of goes over the 12 cranial nerves and their functions. Sort of, you know, if you're a visual person, this can help you visualize these functions. And this will be it for part 1 of the peripheral nervous system. Part 2 will consist of the spinal nerves.